All right, seniors. So we're talking about the Kennedy administration and the civil rights movement in this bit of lecture here. And the Kennedy administration, okay, well, look, it's John F. Kennedy, right, the president, and he's working closely with his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Why? Well, he trusts them as his advisor. But Robert F. Kennedy is the attorney general, which means he's responsible for enforcing the laws in the nation. He's responsible for enforcing and protecting the constitutional rights of Americans, okay? And when Americans' constitutional rights are being violated, Robert F. Kennedy is supposed to come in and prosecute those who are violating it. Or he's supposed to work with the federal marshals or the army or the Federal Bureau of Investigation to suppress those who would threaten the civil rights or the constitutional rights of Americans. Okay? The problem is that the Kennedys are not going to take a strong stance on civil rights. They are moderates in terms of civil rights. Okay? Now, they do some things that are beneficial to the civil rights movement. They try to hire more black people in the federal government, for instance. They try to appoint black people as federal judges, including among the appointees included among the appointees of Kennedy is Thurgood Marshall to a federal judge position. Okay, they do enforce the desegregation of bus facilities serving interstate bus travel after the Freedom Rides. Okay, and they do that in the fall of 1961. So they do some good things, but they are not willing to intervene. They're not willing to intervene in a strong way in 1961 and 2 to protect the lives of protesters and activists in the South who face the possibility of death whenever they're involved in, challenging the Jim Crow laws, the segregation of the South. All right? Okay. And that's the central issue, that the Kennedy administration is would rather neglect, would rather not look at what's happening in the South, would rather not step in to, in a dramatic way, protect the lives of the activists and the protesters. And that failure to do that in 61 and 62 is what is so upsetting to black activists and protesters, all right? Now, JFK and Robert F. Kennedy themselves, they're not, on a personal level, bigots, right? They don't support segregation, okay? But they are politicians, okay? And John F. Kennedy he's a Democrat, right? He does not want to alienate Southern voters by taking a strong stance on civil rights, okay? And this is kind of where this question of morality and the role that religion should play in a politician's life becomes important, right? Because Robert F. Kennedy, if he had listened to the dictates of his Catholic religion, he would have had to come out more strongly in favor of civil rights, okay? Because there's a moral command, right, that every person is created in the image of God, and you have to respect that, okay? But he's kind of putting politics ahead of morality here, and he doesn't want to alienate the Southern voters, right, because he's a Democrat. Okay. The other problem that Kennedy has is that if he's going to really enforce the constitutional rights of the protesters, he's going to have to work with the FBI to do that. And the FBI in particular, one of the things they're responsible for is investigating domestic terrorism, including the domestic terrorism of white supremacists, like people in the KKK. So the murders and the violence that's in the South, the Federal Bureau of Investigations really had a responsibility to be investigating all of that. But the guy that's in charge of the FBI, Herbert Hoover, is deeply suspicious of the civil rights movement. In fact, he believes there are communists all infiltrated and through the civil rights movement. And he thinks that Martin Luther King Jr. is tied up with communists. He convinces Robert F. Kennedy to allow him to wiretap Martin Luther King Jr.'s home because he thinks there's all these communists running around in there. Okay, there weren't any communists, all right? There were not communists in the civil rights movement. At least none tied directly to Martin Luther King Jr., but Herbert Hoover is paranoid about it, and he doesn't trust the civil rights movement, okay? And so Kennedy is not going to challenge Hoover. He's not going to push Hoover to take a stronger stance against the terrorism in the South, terrorism of the white supremacists in the South. Why? Because Herbert Hoover has dirt on Kennedy, right? Kennedy is, unfortunately, not faithful to his wife. And Kennedy, Kennedy was having an affair with the mistress of this mob boss, and Herbert Hoover knew about it. Okay, and Kennedy can't really he wants to avoid the public finding out about this, right? So he can't really force Herbert Hoover to to do anything. And the other thing about this mob boss situation, the CIA was also working with the mob boss to try to assassinate Castro, okay? And for all these complicated reasons, but especially because the mistress was involved, JFK can't prosecute the mob boss, and he's also opened himself up to the possibility of blackmail, okay? So it's a bad situation, right? JFK should not, of course he should have been faithful to his wife, but you see the problem with it. The problem is also that it ties his hands in terms of doing the right thing. He can't force Herbert Hoover to do anything right now, okay? All right, so the bigger problem, though, is not just that JFK is kind of putting... well, not the big one. Another problem is not just that JFK is putting politics in front of morality. It's also that he seems to be on a personal level a little bit ambivalent about the civil rights movement. Okay, so again, he's not a bigot. He doesn't support segregation, but he's not particularly energized to challenge it. Okay, he's focused on the Cold War. That's his main thing, right? He wants to be the tough guy against Khrushchev. All right. And in the summer of 1961, that's when the freedom rides are taking place, and the kids are getting beat up when they go into Birmingham, and they're getting arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. In the middle of all this, JFK is what is he worried about? Well, he's worried about meeting Khrushchev in Vienna in the summer of 1961. He's just coming off the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was embarrassing, and he wants to prove that he's tough against Khrushchev. And of course, he wants to portray himself as having the moral high ground. Well, what do the freedom rides do? They're bad publicity for the United States. Okay, that you have this problem with white supremacist terrorism in the South. And not just, of course, the segregation laws themselves and the discrimination itself, but the terrorism of the white supremacists. And so JFK's like, well, the freedom rides they need to stop doing this because, this is making America look bad to the world, and we can't look bad right now because we have to be strong against Khrushchev in the midst of the Cold War thing. And so he's saying, well, can't the freedom riders just stop? Can't you just make them stop? You know what I mean? So to him, it's a less important issue, right? And it needs to be kind of put on the back burner as he's pursuing his Cold War policies. Okay, so for these various reasons, Kennedy is not really taking a strong stance on civil rights in 1961 and 1962. In that fall of 1961, he does agree to, again, probably is a good thing. This is a very good thing he does, which to enforce the desegregation of the bus facilities that are serving buses going between states. That's good. But generally speaking, he does not want the federal government to intervene. All right. And what he wants to do is he wants to resolve situations by negotiating with Southern politicians. Okay, so with the Freedom Riders, for instance, one of the reasons that in Mississippi, the Freedom Riders are not getting beat up in the way they were in Alabama is because the Kennedys have been negotiating with the governor of Mississippi, Barnett, and they had, basically said they would not interfere with the local police's arrest of the protesters so long as order was maintained. So in Mississippi, in the summer of 61, you didn't have a lot of kids getting beaten up, but everybody was getting arrested, and the federal government was not doing anything about it, right? And the Kennedys basically kind of washed their hands of that and said, well, they weren't going to interfere with local state police authority, okay? So even this basically they said they sent an assistant attorney general out there to make that statement, right? But of course, it seems to contradict exactly what happened with Eisenhower when he had to send federal troops into Little Rock to protect the students there trying to integrate Central High School. Okay, but they're trying to avoid that. They don't want to get involved in this. The problem is this isn't going to work. Okay, as we've seen since the beginning of the course when we were talking about the Reconstruction period. White supremacy is not going to get broken except with the support of federal troops. You're going to have to do it, okay? And that reality is going to be highlighted first with the attempted integration of the University of Mississippi, but more strongly in 1963 with the outbreak of violence in Birmingham.